you very much for having me and for the introduction. Excited to be here. So, in terms of background, as was said, my name's Keegan. I'm a lecturer in AI government and policy at the Oxford Internet Institute, and I'm also a adjunct senior fellow at the Center for New American Security in DC and National Security and Technology. Before coming to Oxford, I worked for about 10 years in Estonia, doing my master's and my PhD, um, working on issues related to sort of digitalization of the public sector. And I think that what I want to talk about today kind of is born from that experience. So there's really two things to talk about. One is this piece on sort of the rise of tech-enabled states, and the other is around this report that I did with the Estonian government and some other colleagues on how to build a resilient digital state. And I think perhaps as a way to start, what I like to point out is that when the sort of internet sort of came and started to proliferate, it really started to understand the way in which we thought about power and the way in which we talked about power. Uh, a lot of the competition that we're seeing now around AI is sort of a continuation of this transformation. The internet in the 1990s was sort of viewed as this tool of liberation that would be able to give power back to the people, enhance democracy, and all these other sorts of nice normative goals. With President Clinton even saying, I think that in the new century, liberty will spread by cell phone and cable modem, and that trying to control the internet would be like trying to nail Jello to the wall. But what we saw is that that's not necessarily true, and authoritarian states and maybe less democratic states have had actually pretty high internet penetration rates. They've had, uh, you know, quite they've been quite successful, I would say, in terms of influencing control over the internet, and as a result, they themselves have also sort of grown in power and influence. And this was kind of the starting point for this essay on what I'm calling the rise of tech-enabled states, which is trying to understand how this emerging geopolitical regime, which is increasingly sort of influenced by advances in emerging technology and digitalization, is transforming the way in which we think about the state. And there are sort of two different perspectives that you'll hear. So there'll be one which is basically making the argument that the state is becoming increasingly irrelevant as digital transformation sort of continues to advance, that you can automate it away, that the state is basically inefficient, that the private sector is more efficient, and that essentially if the government worked more like Amazon, everything would be better off. On the other hand, you have those who point out that it's actually the state that makes markets, that guarantees intellectual property rights, that provides national security. Uh, and from that perspective, the state's not going away anytime soon. I think I kind of see it as a slightly differently, definitely not on the team that thinks the state's going away, but I do think the way in which we think about the state is transforming, and the way in which we think about power is transforming. Uh, and I think there are sort of a few components to this. One is that digitalization is absolutely transforming the way in which governments work. It's no longer possible to not digitalize. I think governments and states that fail to digitalize are going to become increasingly irrelevant, to be honest, as time goes on. It's basically a necessity. And COVID-19 really showed the importance of this, with states that were digital being able to perform better, continue operations in sort of non-typical operating circumstances. But what that means is, one, there's a lot of investment flowing into digitalization at the moment. Uh, Sort of associated with this, a lot of this digitalization is being driven by private sector actors, not necessarily internal to the government itself, which means there's real opportunities to sort of use and leverage your domestic tech industry to spread your influence abroad. If you're a first mover when it comes to digitalization, or take the example of AI, and you're able to demonstrate how you can use this technology to improve some aspect of your government, you will have others who are coming to you to sort of learn how you did that, and this can grow sort of soft power influence abroad. Obviously, traditionally, Estonia is one really good example of this, where you have countries the size of India going to Estonia, which has a population of 1 million, to learn how they did it. Uh, and I think you're going to see more and more and more of that. Then the other side of this is that as these states become increasingly digital, you start to build up new physical vulnerabilities as well. in the sense that people like to think that the cloud is something ethereal, it's just out floating in space, but realistically, it's cement and concrete and steel and fiber optic cables. And so what we saw during Ukraine actually was that some of the earliest targets of Russian missiles were Ukrainian government data centers. One reason for that was to kind of try and disrupt the functioning of their government operations, their digital government operations. And so what all of this sort of starts to point to is that if you want to be influential in the sort of emergent geopolitical order, you need to be digital, but you also need to have sort of resilience and things like this built into place. So together with the Estonian government, we kind of worked through what this might look like, uh, and came up with sort of 7 different, recommendations. I'm not going to go through them all, but the idea was basically that because you have these sort of physical vulnerabilities, it should be possible to, for example, think about how do you run the digital state from a cloud or from the cloud based on the territory of another country. In Estonia, they already have a data embassy where critical data assets are backed up and given the same rights as a sort of traditional embassy, but wanting to move beyond that. And conflict is one reason for this. But even more so, you could think about natural disasters or countries like Tuvalu and Kiribati, which might disappear due to rising sea levels. What would it mean for their government to sort of live on, or for their culture to live on digitally, um, even if they lost, their physical territory, or if there's an earthquake that took out a government data center? There's lots of reasons to actually be thinking about this. Uh, and then there are other important things to think about. So during times of crisis, people kind of forget that public servants are people too, and also influenced by crises. So at the moment, the US is shutting down the ability to work from home, but actually being able to continue government operations with a fully remote workforce from a resilience standpoint is quite good, and something that's also enabled by digital technologies. And really what all of this sort of points to, and I realize this is sort of a little bit rambly, and I think the discussion part will be more interesting, is that governments who are able to sort of take the early steps now to set the foundations, to demonstrate how you can do this, to leverage their tech industry, to build out solutions that other governments work on, will become increasingly influential. Right now, the US has the biggest advantage in the sense that they own much of the world's digital infrastructure. They own the hyperscalers, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. These are all American companies. Uh, Europe obviously doesn't like this so much, and you get into these conversations around digital sovereignty. But without their sort of own domestic alternatives, there's really not much that you can do in this space. The flip side to this is these same technology companies are quite critical in defending and maintaining sort of status quo and normal operations. We know that in conflict environments, companies like Microsoft and Google actually are quite important. So you can't necessarily just get rid of them, because they do have this important part, but without any sort of domestic alternative, it's not clear what the answer is. And so moving forward, you're just going to see so many more of these questions on sort of appropriate balance between technology providers and the state, increasing digitalization. How much do you want to sort of outsource to the private sector? Obviously, we've been through the whole new public management thing before, and none of these are necessarily new. But I do think this starts to get increasingly important as you start forecasting out into the future around AI and the increasing usage of AI by public sector organizations. Uh, what would it mean, for example, to start creating new public service delivery mechanisms that are able to combine private data with public data to improve, let's say, personal and proactive public service delivery? If I know that my genetic data is held by the state, and I also have a Fitbit, how can I sort of combine my, like my daily health information with the data that's held in my electronic health register to, for example, suggest tests that I might need given a genetic predisposition, or there's lots of stuff in this space, and I'm having conversations with governments around it, and they're interested in it. So basically, this is kind of the things that I'm thinking about, some of the issues that I'm working on. Uh, and would be curious to, take questions. And I think, Johanna, you had a few questions as well.
But I want to come back to something you did touch on there. You mentioned about how states have to have this strong tech capability, in part, so it can influence the world's digital infrastructure. This is almost the new it's a mix, isn't it? It's a mix between soft and hard power, being able to influence the world's infrastructure. And just this week, um, Monday, we saw how, in fact, one of the what we thought was going to be the most important infrastructure, one of the most important infrastructures going forward, GPUs. Um, uh, Nvidia, the American biggest maker of GPUs, had 600 billion, I think, was it, wiped off their capital value because of this whole idea that there was a technology coming through from China, the DeepSeek technology, developing LLMs that would not require so much processing power. So I'd like to, kind of, if you could like talk briefly about kind of where does that sit in that whole world of, as you were saying, where is your kind of private public? If America had actually invested in all that, as a nation had invested in creating all those GPUs and not, kind of outsourcing it to Nvidia, where would they be right now? And the other thing that I would like to hear your views on is, you said that the strength of these companies, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, the Googles, Nvidias, has been perceived as a threat that can lead to the demise of the state, but you feel that's largely misplaced, if I understand you correctly, because the companies would largely align with the beliefs and orientations of the countries in which they're situated. And I feel personally that Elon Musk perhaps brings this a little bit into question, because there have been some things he's been doing which I perceive as perhaps not aligning with Western states who might be normally considered as allies of the United States. Is he the exception that proves the rule, or is he doing something else? So just like your views on those two aspects.
I think all of this hints at just why it's so important for countries to start thinking about their domestic tech capability seriously. So let's move to the example of DeepSeek that you asked about first. I think one thing that's important to understand is that the US very much sees the AI revolution as being the American AI revolution, and that's basically a verbatim quote from Alex Karp, who's the CEO of Palantir. And you can see this play out in terms of how they're approaching this globally, from regulatory movements to investment to export controls. So uh, the US knows that basically when it comes to sort of emerging advances in AI, you need capital and you need compute, and it has ridiculous amounts of both of these. From the compute perspective, NVIDIA is an American company. Uh, TSMC, ASML, might be blanking the names at the moment, but basically the Netherlands company that's dealing with the sort of GPUs, and then Taiwan equivalent, uh, are directly related to sort of US interests. And it puts pressure on them to align with itself. We saw during the initial export controls that the US put in place, which were to not deny China's ability to access compute that it would need to train state-of-the-art AI models, that NVIDIA actually made changes to deliver GPUs that were fairly equivalent, but just under the sort of threshold. And these are the sorts of things that DeepSeek is using. There's some sort of debate around this, but we know they have actually quite a lot of compute that they were able to buy in spite of the export controls. And so the idea here was the US wanted to deny sort of geopolitical adversaries the ability to train AI or to compete in the ecosystem at the sort of level that it was operating at. The problem is it didn't have full ability to get NVIDIA to sort of align with its interests, and that's probably good. There's got to be a balance here in terms of how close or how much you want to be the government to be able to force a company to act in your interests. But certainly there's going to be a lot more conversations moving forward into the future of what does this look like, how much, like, how integrated do you want the private and the public sector to be, how unified do you want them to be when it comes to uh, enacting sort of broader geopolitical goals. There's a great piece in Foreign Affairs that talks about, titled something to the effect of welcome the C-suite to geopolitics or something like that. And it basically explores these issues about how increasingly sort of board members are going to have to try to figure out how they align with the spirit of the law, not necessarily the wording, because these supply chains are getting increasingly complex. Now, the other side to this is that the US also, under the Biden administration, had the BIS rules, which divide Europe into tier one and tier two countries. And it's another sort of example of showing that the US wants to be the sort of predominant force when it comes to AI development. And if you think about this from a public sector perspective, it's quite interesting because it's the US saying we own this technology, but we also know governments are going to want to be using it. And so it's a way of sort of forcing the rest of the world to increase its dependence on the US. From a US perspective, this is actually fantastic. It's a great benefit for its national security. It gets people in line with its interests, dependent on its technology. If you're in Europe or Africa or South America, it's a very different story, I would say, uh, because you are growing this dependence on a sort of another country or its respective industry. Similarly, if you think about this example about running the state from the cloud digitally, what does it mean to sort of trust a private sector actor with increasingly critical and sensitive government data assets to the point where you're actually running the state from the cloud? A lot of work needs to go in from a legal and regulatory perspective there. The second side, or the second question here around Elon Musk. Uh, from a US perspective, I think it's fair to say that he's actually quite aligned with the current administration, seeing as how much effort he put into supporting Donald Trump's campaign, his support for things like freedom of speech, these sorts of issues. So yes, he might be not the most popular person in Europe at the moment, but from like a US perspective, I would maybe push back on the idea that he's not completely aligned with their interests, with the caveat that there's some uproar over how he challenged the president on the new Stargate project that Sam Altman announced. Uh, but what all this points at is that increasingly there's going to, one important part of state capacity will be how do you work with the private sector? How do you get them to work, in line with your interests, and sort of vice versa. I think Marietje Schaake has a really good book from the European perspective on the big tech coup, which is, trying to highlight how American tech companies might not be the most supportive of democracy, how this builds in potential weaknesses or threats to Europe and its future digital sovereignty. But completely banning American tech companies without having a domestic alternative also raises its own sort of challenges as well. And when it comes to things like DeepSeek, you know, policymakers should be asking themselves questions why their own domestic tech communities weren't able to sort of do the same thing. It's not like that team in particular had access to materials that other people didn't. Just the ecosystem and the incentives are quite different.
The story about US supremacy in this is massively overstated. So the reality is that most of the silicon is built in China and Taiwan. NVIDIA and ARM are design shops. You can take away their breakfast very quickly. We know how GPUs work, and there are at least two alternatives out there that can be rapidly adopted. The DeepSeek message was that the pre-export controlled system forced somebody to think harder about poor resources and come up with something that parallelized better on memory bandwidth limited devices. And that forces you down a road which many people had appreciated outside of the US, where you didn't have arbitrary amounts of money to spend on electricity, courtesy of venture capitalists who didn't think of a business case yet. And had actually thought about business cases and said, well, we don't need LLMs. What we want to do is AI. We need GPUs, but we can probably do things with the cores with a Metal API on Apple equipment with ARM cores. No dependence on the US, except if you insist on using a MacBook to do this. But there's also the software supply side. Most of the cloud runs on Linux and uses open source. That Linux is European development, not a US development. Most of the software platforms are completely open source, whether you use PyTorch or whatever. You run on platforms that are largely open source. And again, we could just close the borders with the US and go on working completely happily, as long as we don't want to use 10,000 GPUs or 100,000 or whatever number you think Meta is using for its advertising model. But if we actually want to do things like medical image processing, which can be done very easily on small devices and has been being done for 30 years in Europe. So, and I'd say, Europe has also demonstrated, and Russia and China have demonstrated, we can do other technology that takes a lot of investment. And certainly Airbus completely outcompetes Boeing nowadays. And so, we can develop something that is a high investment, and the supply side is just not the US. That's just not the correct historical model. It's not the current model. The narrative is that way because the venture capitalists want you to buy that. In particular, the CEOs of a couple of companies don't want people to panic about their share price. And again, the DeepSeek message, the lesson here was, oh, well, actually, that was a realignment of, who really can do stuff. Well, just about anyone, actually. So I'm not sure everything else you said, I completely agree. We really, really need to make sure we have the whole supply side done. But if we had to, if somebody said, oh, we're going to put tariffs on Europe unless you buy everything from the hyperscale US companies, the European could retaliate and say, well, actually, that's not a problem. We've already had data centers localized in Europe because GDPR. We've already got AI software capability in any area, including LLMs, actually, to be honest, that most of the development of the really cool stuff that went open source that came out of Meta was done in London. It wasn't done in the US. So there's a whole list of things here where I personally think the real people who should be scared is the US because they took up this story. The Trump story, with OpenAI was we're going to invest 500 billion, which is basically half of a UK GDP for a year, in infrastructure for AI, and the rest of us are looking at it going, well, that's fine, you can go do that. What for? There is literally no reason to do that. We're actually getting on with all of the applications which have business cases for lots of money, including, for example, again in London, DeepMind do protein folding. They don't use 100,000 GPUs to do protein folding. They use a lot of HPC performance, which we already have. The physics community across Europe already had a ton of cluster compute because they wanted to do processing of data coming off the Large Hadron Collider, and people want to do processing coming off the Genome Project. Two more basic science projects that were European based. So I'm just want to slightly adjust the sort of positioning of the fear metric. I completely agree with where are the supply chains? I really like the Estonian story about having national capability and having it offshored in their embassy. I think we should all be doing that. I think that's a really good plan, and it's a shame that Ukraine hadn't done more of that, although it's a much bigger country. So I think they assumed that security, probably correctly, it was really hard to take out all of their technology infrastructure, and that sort of proved to be roughly right. If you look at the Microsoft observatories and cybersecurity inside Ukraine, but anyway, yeah, I think I was just trying to make a slight adjustment in favor of the rest of the world, and the polemic, a lot of it has come from people who have to hype their value because there is no business case. You can't do retraining a 350 billion parameter OpenAI model. Nobody will let you do it inside Microsoft who are using it because there's no customer paying anymore. That was an initial investment they made, and now the emperor has new clothes. Nobody's actually, no clothes, and nobody's come along saying, that 5 million for retraining on this extra data you managed to scavenge from somewhere. Um, Show me a line that gives you the equivalent for what I might do with a really simple, image processing AI that does something with, I don't know, echocardiograms or better weather prediction to predict floods to prevent farmers, losing their crop, or there's a whole bunch of things, none of which need that scale of infrastructure, all of which we already have, core, mostly open. But
So,
anyway,
Keegan,
it's more
Yeah.
just an adjustment. So
yes, you
No, I
can
was just
come
going to
back.
say, on the open source point, I fully agree. I think this is one area where the U.S. kind of shot itself in the foot. It was not, I think it was in December when you had prominent senators basically saying, responding to reporting that the Chinese, well, basically the PLA was using Llama 1, and this was a national security threat, and they therefore needed to ban open source AI, which is completely ridiculous. And I think actually what you see is from the Chinese perspective, they're quite supportive of open source. And it's quite a big problem actually for the West if they're not actively engaging in this ecosystem, as you rightfully point out. So there's full agreement with me on that side, but it once again becomes this issue of, if you think about, or rather the way that I think about it is that when it comes to sort of digitalization of the public sector, when you start forecasting out into the future, we know from this experience with software, open source is going to be important. It's absolutely going to be the case that open source AI is going to be equally important. Therefore, it's probably important for states to be paying attention to who's building this open source AI, where is it hosted, what is the infrastructure. At the moment, in terms of the scale of compute needed to do inference to, let's say, a couple 100 million folks at large, not necessarily numbers today, but if it progresses, it's really hard to find that computational capability outside of sort of major US providers. That can change. You need money. I mean, I think the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia are making huge investments in this space as well. Um, as is China, but now they have to use their sort of homegrown chips, DSNs, which are okay for inference. Um, but the point is that the tech space increasingly becoming a sort of new battleground for states. Not only the sort of hard tech capabilities, i.e., we have the biggest model, but increasingly important is also the process side, demonstrating how to use it, getting people on board with your standards. And actually, on the sort of broader US-China competition point, I think Kai-Fu Lee did an interview a couple of months ago where he more or less made the argument that if AGI is possible, the US will probably get there first, but they will be able to scale it across their ecosystem better. They have sort of more work done on building out digital infrastructure, investing in digitalization. And I think on the point around AI that you raised about the use cases, this is also another important point. It doesn't really matter if you have the biggest model if nobody's using it and you can't do anything with it. What's more important is you're able to extract value from it, which sort of is another point of connection between the sort of like internal digitalization and this broader geopolitical type conversation, which I think this intersection hasn't received nearly enough attention.
So, Keegan, well, how this all this relates with this digital public infrastructure kind of discussion, right? Which obviously, anyway, is very much driven by the initial inventors of the term, which I believe is India, who has this India stack, and then becomes like, anyway, and then everyone needs to have the Euro stack now, and then everyone needs to have their own kind of stack, which anyway goes back to a little bit of what you said is kind of, anyway, and then it's very much driven by states, right? And so it goes back to kind of the role of states to actually put this under their umbrella of kind of digital sovereignty, data sovereignty, and so on, which John also referred to as kind of, anyway, data centers need to be based within territories where they get collected and so on. So that's the first question, how does that relate? And then the second question, if compute is not the defining resource anymore, has data then become the defining resource that will determine the competitive edge as it relates to models, or especially as it relates to kind of augmentation for applications? So, question.
I'll take the second one first. I don't think it's fair to say that compute doesn't matter, and I think a lot of the conversation around DeepSeek has gone a little bit off base with that. DeepSeek's actually been offline, basically restricting registration to their online tool for the last couple of days, and we know that's because of compute issues. They just can't handle the scale, the sort of inference that they need to do with the amount of people who want to use it. It's absolutely the case that once you're past the sort of like initial training, the economics are starting to make less sense if somebody can just distill your model down and serve it for cheap and these sorts of things. But compute's going to continue to be important. And as we go forward and this model's increase in capability, I don't see that changing. Data obviously is another incredibly important part of this as well. And there's been reports all over the news how we're running out of data, these sorts of things. We're also seeing huge investments into the use of synthetic data and stuff like that. So we will see where that goes, but just to push back on the compute thing, I think it still matters, and I think what you'll probably see with the incoming now the current administration is sort of more restrictions on compute, export controls, more on enforcement, and really trying to crack down on these things would be my guess, but I could be wrong. On the digital public infrastructure side of things, I think this is really interesting because this is going to be one of the ways in which, these states can basically influence sort of broader global conversations and infrastructural components to be aligned with their interests. China is one country, India is one country that's doing a lot in this space. The US has been historically doing, I think, quite a bit less. And when I've been talking with people in the State Department, they will more or less tell you the same thing. And now with the current administration canceling foreign aid for the first 90 days, there's significantly less involvement in this space as well. And that's letting certain countries have a big advantage in trying to outline what DPI looks like, what values are instilled within it. And those might not necessarily be values that are incredibly aligned with sort of more liberal democratic worldviews. I think India, as you say, which sort of coined the DPI stuff and pushed it when they were president of the organization. I don't know. They did it with GPAI, but it was another time as well. They didn't have a data privacy law, I think, when they were building a lot of the India stack and Aadhaar and stuff like that, which is interesting. So it's certainly one place where you can have a lot of influence, and I think it's one place actually. If we do think about Europe, maybe it's not leading in compute and these sorts of things, but one thing that it does do quite well is that it has a lot of capabilities and regulatory innovations in place around interoperability with things like European Interoperability Reference Architecture, EIDAS. We saw during COVID-19, it was able to scale out the certificate verification quite quickly, also to a broader global view. And I think this might be one area where they're able to push this advantage, whereas the US, for example, is much, 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 much worse on the internal digitalization stuff, which provides opportunities for other countries to sort of run ahead if they wanted to.
Hi, Keegan. I'm Nai. I really appreciate your talk, and I appreciate a lot of your work. And I was really excited to see you talk today. So my question, I'm interested in understanding kind of, as there's different types of interdependence increasing through the use of DPIs in different state governments. I look at East Africa primarily, for example. To what extent is that, or can that, or is there instances of it being weaponized as a way to enact different types of state coercion? And I'm also interested in understanding the extractive dynamics that are occurring around that. And so, like, even where in certain places there may be laws in place that would prevent certain types of maybe data extraction, for example, states' abilities to actually exercise those laws may be constrained by other types of geopolitical or trade related means, for example. And so anything you can share is appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think this gets kind of to the heart of it, right? You need strong tech capacity internally and within the government, but also within your private sector industry to understand what's going on, to be able to push back against some of these sorts of things. I think when it comes to the sort of broader geopolitical questions, Africa, particularly East Africa, is viewed as sort of their markets are battlegrounds between the US and China. So you have the digital Silk Road, you have a lot of build out of sort of Chinese tech, 5G infrastructure, smart cities, CCTV networks, in Kenya in particular, where there's a lot of stuff going on. And there's certainly, an extractive component to that. The US has been much worse to respond. And part of the reason is what they don't have much to offer when it comes to the internal digitalization, because they don't have their own systems, whereas other countries, China in particular, does have a lot of experience building this out internally. So they can show up and offer you new smart cities. They can help you rewrite your laws. They can help you implement AI-based solutions. And we've seen a lot of work happen in that space. I know that there was an interesting article in Bloomberg recently that looked at the role that the US was trying to play in trying to get people more or less back aligned with US interests. And yeah, it's sort of annoying. I think there's lots of questions on how to sort of exert, your own agency as well to push back against this sort of idea that you're just pawns between, not you, but like oftentimes these governments are sort of viewed as pawns on the battlefield or the markets and things like that. But there is also a lot of ability for these states to do things as well. So Singapore did a really interesting report together with Rwanda, I think, on the role of small states in broader AI conversations. I think there's a lot that can be done with sort of regional alliances. But a lot of this will sort of come back to trying to, reassert your own interest, but that's increasingly hard to do when there's capital constraints, talent constraints, and these other sorts of issues. It's just all the more reason to sort of take it seriously and make the necessary investments into developing these things.
John, you see you've made a point here about very crucial about sustainability. I mean, you were listing, countries with electricity and of course countries with water, which is becoming more and more rare in some countries and far too much of it in other countries. Is an important point. Where Keegan, does sustainability, not massively popular, I think, under the current US
Nope.
administration, where does that affect what countries are capable of doing, what states are capable of doing?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's obviously there's an environmental impact when it comes to the development of AI. I think when you put the sort of national security and geopolitics hat on, these concerns kind of fall by the wayside. If you're a country and a government or industry comes to you and says, we want to build a data center here, and you say no, then they go to your neighboring country and they put it there. You have this question of, would you rather have the data center in your own country, or would you rather your neighbor, who you maybe don't like very much, has it? And I think you're starting to see this play out with industry playing countries against each other. We already know there's huge investments happening in this space. The US, the grid that they're going to have to build out, it's not anywhere close to what they actually need. And this has really big implications for a lot of the investments that are coming on at the moment, which is you can build massive giant data centers, but you're still talking about a couple of years to build the respective infrastructure to be able to handle the increased sort of electricity requirements. The flip side to that is you're seeing massive investments uh, in like sustainable energy, Microsoft investing in nuclear, you have people investing in other sorts of renewable energy sources. The water component probably one of the bigger issues to solve, and there are countries that are certainly yeah, being taken advantage of in that respect. My colleagues here at the OII have done some interesting work on local communities in Mexico and how this has been affecting them. We recently did a report with the Tony Blair Institute on compute that goes through this sort of current state. And one aspect of this is the environmental side of things, and talks about the broader build out.
I think this sustainability argument has a different aspect. You can't actually build out infrastructure across the scale of Africa. I think people just haven't looked at the map. It's quite big. You've had 100 years of electricity in North America and Europe. In the reliability of the infrastructure in Africa is just too low. And saying, well, we'll put the data center in a neighboring country because Ghana says we can't afford it. Ghana has about 50% of the population don't have any electricity or telecoms. They might have cellular at low bandwidth in some places. So, okay, you say, we'll put it in Nigeria. So what? You can't reach it. So it's no use. And so you've just lost your customer base. If you do something like federated learning, it can run in a decentralized way. And I put a link in for the same thing for weather prediction. We're working with the Gates Foundation on starting to look at deploying weather prediction systems that are AI, that run federated across a small number of nodes with small numbers of weather stations in sub-Saharan Africa, because it's the only sensible way you could do it. You can't run the Met Office physics model in a big data center in Nairobi and tell people what's going to happen in Lagos. But the network won't be there 1% of the time or worse, so they won't get their weather warning for a day. And it will have huge costs. And actually, you do the federated learning system, it doesn't have huge costs. So while I understand this pressure on in North America and Europe to think a little bit about burning a bit more energy and then being a bit sensible about it and having some sources that are renewable or nuclear, if people will tolerate that, which might work in America, but some countries in Europe might be okay with nuclear as a stopgap while we wait till we get more renewable. But the costs of that, again, as an infrastructure, the materials for solar are not good. The reliability of wind as a resource is not necessarily great. And an infrastructure to deliver things across the grid is not great. And then the high bandwidth to get a lot of data from places to a center and then from that center out to customers is also not good. So, I can point you at papers that study, this reliability by people in Kigali who measure it from a subjective viewpoint, or people in Nairobi and who also measure it. The AFRINIC people will give you the data. The Internet Society will give you that data. So, and it takes a really long time to deploy physical infrastructure. You can deploy cellular. Kenya's got really good coverage of cellular anywhere you stand, like India, because you put cell towers every 10 kilometers, it's fine. But this doesn't work for this, this big heavy lifting systems. They require you to do runs of fiber and runs of power, and those are lots of copper for the cables that deliver significant power, and lots of fiber. And the numbers don't actually add up. And then when you put that on top of the cost of just like then you're using electricity for running a data set for something, you're learning a model, you're applying the model. Compared to what was the other thing you could have done with that energy, which could have been cooling or improving agricultural output or whatever, fixing nitrogen to get more fertilizer, many other desalination of water, cleaning water supply, many other things which are ahead. So I read your report. In fact, I think I commented it's a very good report. I encourage everyone to look at it. It's a great report. But I'm just saying that if you look at how this would play out in the global south, and reasonably significant fraction of South America as well as Africa and some parts of South Asia. You know, it's yeah, we're looking at a 10 to 20-year deployment plan to copy the US style of doing things, whereas we have alternatives which can be thrown out there right now, which will be no less reliable, but will not require that infrastructure anyway.
Thank you, Keegan, for the interesting report and the talk. This was really interesting report. I'm like really interesting on how you put like all the stages, especially this phrase is one of the pages. Through technological development and strategic comprehensive digitalization of society is possible for states to increase their resilience by reducing their independence of physical realm. And in this particular part, you also address different issues as security, as all the stages that the states should be taking care into account. And I think one issue was missing, and is the dependency on technology by the states will also mean giving up natural resources and how this will affect. So, for example, in the global south, there was a lot of backlash for the creation of data centers because they take a lot of water. So there was a lot of protest in Chile, in Uruguay, because the creation of these data centers will mean actually removing the water sources for different towns. And this is an aspect that I think you could maybe address in a follow-up report in the next one, because it's something that is missing everywhere else, and no many people can discuss these issues as blindly as you put it in the report. So I will really looking forward to read more about this issue. I only know the links and the reports from Uruguay and Chile that they do not agree on building up the data centers because of the amount of water that it will cost. But I also know, for example, the projects of putting internet through satellites in Colombia by Meta and Google, but it was also stopped because that will mean also invading, for example, the Amazon. And yeah, we don't want that. It belongs of the earth. So all this infrastructure is interesting and we have to take care of it, but how much are we just giving up our natural resources, our natural land to protect? So it should be also a balance between these two.
But obviously, I think this is a conversation every country is going to have on its own when it comes to these sorts of issues. There are reasons, of course, to sort of resist the development of data centers, but there's also reasons to support the development and improve the state's ability to sort of hold data on its own territory, base compute within it, and these other sorts of questions. And whatever is decided will have sort of long-term impacts one way or another. It's not to say that digital is the best for everything. I'm just trying to highlight the different strategic choices that people are going to have to be making. And obviously, these are some of the balancing, some of the considerations that the governments are going to be thinking about, which is, impact on environment, water, these sorts of questions, versus sort of longer term digital security and resilience. But yeah, absolutely an important part of the conversation.
Thank you so much. Utterly fascinating. And I can see a lot of engagement, people asking about things in the chat and connecting with each other on research. And yeah, thank you so much. We really, really appreciate it.